The United States government has given approval to the oil company Shell to restart drilling in the Arctic off of the coast of Alaska, going against warnings from environmentalists that it might lead to ecological disaster. The Obama administration approved Shell's plan focuses on the waters off of the western coast of Alaska, 3 years after the company was forced to suspend operations following a series of accidents. Scientists and environmental groups have attacked the decision and have warned that Shell's exploration could be risky. The US government department, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, said that it had taken a thoughtful approach to considering the exploration, adding that any offshore exploratory activities would be subject to rigorous standards. The Arctic seas, over which 4 countries claim rights to the ocean floor, are estimated to contain 24 billion barrels of oil. Nathaniel Emerson, The Report.
Well, to discuss the last story we've just seen, in the studio we have Charlie Kronick, who's Senior Arctic Campaigner for Greenpeace, and Natalie Bennett, leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Let me start with you, Natalie. I mean, Shell stopped drilling about 2 or 3 years ago. Why did they have to stop?
Well, they had to stop because there'd basically been 2 incidents, both in terms of some problems with some safety equipment, and then the drilling rig that they'd been using actually ran aground. Now, the contractor they were using for that was fined $12 million US. And there's been a lot of concern and a lot of wrangling since about the safety issues, the issues of the risk of spills in this environment, this pristine environment, how hard it is to clean it up. That's one set of issues about drilling in the Arctic. The other broader set of issues is the fact, of course, we have to leave at least 2/3 of our known fossil fuel reserves in the ground if we're going to avoid catastrophic climate change. And that's just not me or the Green Party saying that, that's the International Energy Agency saying that. So, we shouldn't be going out looking for new sources of fossil fuels. What we have to be doing is working out how we make the changeover to a low-carbon economy.
But if we just stick for a moment, Charlie Kronick, on the safety issue, I mean, the US government is saying this approval is conditional on further tests and so on. I mean, do you think Shell is up to the job of making sure it really will be safe?
Well, as Natalie said, on the basis of their past performance, absolutely not. 2012 was just a catalog of problems, and you only have to look at the U.S. government's own investigations. The Coast Guard study showed dozens of areas where their equipment was not up to scratch, but really, possibly even more importantly in terms of this summer, clearly the biggest problems they had with their contractors is, again, as Natalie said, Noble, who run the Noble Discoverer, and Transocean, who run the other rig, the Polar Pioneer. That's the same Transocean who was responsible for the Deepwater Horizon. And one of the conditions of them getting these permissions was that there would be an audit and a published audit of their relationships with contractors. That's yet to happen. There's absolutely no evidence that they're doing a better job of looking after those people, or those people are doing a better job of looking after the equipment. So I think that, the obvious answer is no, they're not ready to go back.
And Natalie, I mean, is there geopolitics behind this? I mean, Russia is doing more and more drilling in the Arctic. Are the Americans now worried about Russia being too, dominant in the Arctic area?
Well, I think what we're seeing is we see with many of our governments, the oil and gas industries have huge influence, huge lobbying. They, of course, want to go out and grow their businesses, expand. And I think that really is the key issue of this. We've got to ask the question of who governments are listening to and what evidence they're hearing. We found in the British government, there's been a huge revolving door between the Energy Department and the energy companies. And people get seconded for a year or two. And we also see that ministers, welcome the oil industry through the door with open arms, and campaigners, organisations that are really concerned about the planet, concerned about the condition of human beings, find it rather hard to get through that same door. So I think we've got a real problem of the level of influence here. And we've really got to ask the question about, we've seen some good steps from President Obama in terms of climate change, in terms of action he's taken. But, is he really taking this issue seriously enough? It's very clear that he isn't. And that really is where we need to focus, particularly with the Paris talks coming up at the end of the year.
Well, the other big pipeline is the Keystone pipeline that connects the US and Canada. I mean, the US Congress is looking at that? Has the administration already approved it?
Well, it's not been approved. It's in a very strange place. The Congress tacked it onto a weird appropriations bill to approve it, one that was completely unrelated to the Keystone pipeline. The president rejected it on the basis of not environmental concerns, but on the basis of executive versus legislative privilege. There's a real danger that coming back to the issue of geopolitics, that there will be a trade-off, and that the permission in the Arctic will be traded off against a decision not to allow the Keystone pipeline. But it's not a question of if one's okay, then the other isn't. They're both completely wrong.
Which is worse?
Well, it's very interesting. The Keystone Pipeline will deliver tar sands, the world's dirtiest oil, currently being produced to refineries in the Gulf of Mexico for export around the world. That's something that's happening in real time. Even if Shell, by some miracle, successfully drills for oil this summer in Alaska without causing a serious incident, even according to their own best projections, it's going to be 10 years and probably much more like 20 or 35 years before oil is ever produced in the Arctic. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, if the world is still thinking about producing oil in such a risky place at such high prices in 2 or 3 decades' time, clearly we will have entirely given up on any efforts to respond to climate change. So the politics cut both ways. Keystone's a nightmare in the short term. The Arctic is potentially a nightmare for local environmental impacts in the short term, but the real downside comes down the road when climate change becomes not just unavoidable but catastrophic.
And this is particularly surprising, really, when you think about the fact that we're seeing particularly solar energy is really powering ahead. We're seeing storage of which works very well with renewables, really powering ahead, particularly in the US, but also in places like China. So this really is a dinosaur industry, the last thrashing throes of a dinosaur industry that as you were saying, it simply cannot be around in 20 or 30 years' time. We have to have replaced it, and that means what we're really doing is wasting vast amounts of money.
Well, let me come on back to the Paris Summit on climate change, which you touched on before. We now have a new British government, or at least a newly re-elected British government, and we have the same Environmental Secretary, Amber Rudd, who's just been appointed on climate change issues. I mean, do you think she's up to the job of handling the issue in Paris?
Well, I think, let's say we're glad that we didn't see a turnaround and the return of Owen Paterson, who, after he was removed from that role, then it became clear that he didn't even believe in human-caused climate change. I think Amber Rudd does believe in human-caused climate change. What I'm concerned about is the whole government policy, the whole approach. And under the previous coalition government, we saw, the greenest government ever became a sad, sick joke. That was the label they put on themselves at the start. But they spent no government money on energy efficiency measures, providing people with warm, comfortable, affordable to heat homes, a great way in which you can create jobs, cut poverty and cut carbon emissions. They've promised to a whole lot of road building when they should be looking at funding public transport. This is a whole government heading in the right direction. So I'm not feeling optimistic about the British stance in Paris, but it's very much up to civil society, campaigners, organisations to push this government as hard as it can. Because ultimately what we're talking about here is actually not politics, it's physics. We cannot keep pumping these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We have to stop. And we've really got to make sure that if the government isn't pointed in the right direction, they get pushed in the right direction.
And how much traction do you think there is behind the idea of just not taking any more out of the ground at all?
I think it's a widely variable question depending on where you're taking out of the ground. I think that you can make a case, an economic case, a local environmental case, never mind the climate case, for walking away from the Arctic right now. And actually, I think rather than in a weird kind of way, it's almost perverse, the desperation Shell is showing for going for the Arctic shows actually that they're in a relatively weak position. Their political, institutional position, very strong. They're very, very close to government. But they're having to go to the most expensive, most dangerous, most technically difficult places in the world to add to their reserves. They absolutely are in an end game. It's very obvious when you hear the oil industry talking about throwing coal and the coal industry under a bus, that we're now in a situation where the fossil fuel giants, who even just a few years ago were supporting each other and saying they're going to be part of the future, they're now fighting like cats in a bag. And I think the reality is that the age of the fossil fuels is coming to an end. But of course, when any dangerous animal gets cornered, they fight that much harder. So I think there is, the next few years are going to be absolutely crucial. And it is fundamental that civil society and, just folks in the street get serious about this because they are so close to government. Those institutional links really have to be challenged.
Well, thank you both very much indeed, Natalie Bennett and Charlie Kronick.